It's making luck. It's making luck. It's making luck with Wandering Winder. It's making luck. It's making luck. Why am I doing this? This is definitely not going to be how I open the show. It's probably because I don't have any idea on how I want to start exactly. Like, I know what I want to talk about, but I don't have a way to get into that.
Well, the haters gonna hate, 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 and the faker's gonna fake, 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 baby. I'm just gonna make, making luck, a Dominion podcast.
Welcome back to Making Luck, a Dominion podcast. Wandering Winder here, just following up on some of the previous things we've been talking about, surrounding kind of end game play and the view that people have of riskiness versus safeness and all of that kind of stuff. And today I want to talk about a situation where I think people kind of go wrong the other way, which is, so mostly I've been talking about people are not concerned enough about, or they're too concerned about being safe and not taking risks. So they're too risk averse, quote unquote, in endings and sometimes outside of endings as well. But in this episode, I want to talk about a way where I think people aren't risk averse enough. And that's to do with pileouts. Now, I should lead by saying here that, like, going for pileouts, A, first of all, isn't always risky, and B, certainly isn't always bad. But I think there's a number of situations, well, basically a specific set of situations where I see people too eager to set them up, and that can lead to some problems and lead to not winning some games that should have been won with more careful play. So let's talk about why setting them up is bad, and to do that, we have to figure out when setting them up is bad. In general, setting them up is not something that I think is something you should really actively be trying to do that much, although there's definitely situations where you do want to do it, so don't take this too harshly. But, okay, when is it good and when is it not? Setting up a pile out, lowering piles, and I don't just mean lowering piles by, like, I'm just gaining some cards on, like, turn 4, which technically lowers a pile, but I mean lowering piles for the purpose of lowering piles, is advantageous to players in certain kinds of positions and disadvantageous to other kinds of players. It's not just a neutral thing, it has strategic implications. So let's talk about what those are. Lowering piles is usually good for you if your deck quality is a worse quality deck than your opponent's deck quality, right? And the reason for that is if your opponent has a higher quality deck, then they're going to be more advantaged in a long game. So the longer the game goes, the more that quality of deck advantage that your opponent has is going to be able to shine through, right? You can kind of think of it as their deck quality advantage gives them some overall tangible, it's a temporary advantage, kind of, although it probably persists because they'll continue to have it. But it accrues, like, final advantage in terms of points at the end of the game. Maybe not directly, but basically it advances their position by some amount every turn that the game goes extra, right? Because the amount that they're able to do in a turn times the number of turns is the amount that they're able to do in the game. And the amount that you're able to do in a turn times the number of turns is the amount that you're able to do in a game. So, first of all, having an extra turn is great because then you're multiplying by an extra one turn, right? But also, just if their deck quality minus your deck quality is a positive number for them, then multiplying that by a larger number of turns is going to give them more of an advantage. Basically, that's That's what I'm saying here. If your deck quality is better, you want the game to go longer, which means you don't want to lower piles. Um, the other way that lowering piles is good for you is if you're ahead in points. So if you're ahead in points, then making the game end faster is generally a good thing, because if the game ends, you win if you have more points than them. The further ahead in points you are, the more advantageous that lowering piles is. If you're up by like 1 point, and that's a negligible fraction of what either of you was expecting to get on a turn, then it's a pretty negligible reason why it would be ahead for you and why it would be good for you. Especially if at the end of your turn you're up by 1 point, then it's probably quite negligible. But yeah. The other way that lowering piles can be good for you is if you have more pile control than your opponent. But there's a caveat to this, which is lowering piles is good for you in this case to a point, and beyond that point it ceases to be good. So like if your opponent can get 3 or 4, say 4 things on a turn, and you can get 20 things on a turn, then lowering things to where there's 4 things left for a pile out, probably not good for you. Lowering things to where there's 12 things left for a pile out, yeah, then you're going to be able to pile out, right? Um, so so having pile control lets you control the game end to an extent, but even if it's more than your opponent can do in maybe strictly speaking 1 turn, you don't necessarily want to lower it too much, because then that dissipates, right? If the amount of pile control you have is much greater than what's needed to end the game, then it starts to approach what your opponent can do, and it dissipates your deck control advantage. Again, it depends a little bit on how much extra gains they have and the points situation and all of that. It's just a very broad generality I'm speaking in here. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of how it advantages one player versus another is who's expected to win overall. So if you're behind overall in terms of win rate, then lowering piles makes the game shorter and more random. And shorter, more random games, it's like we talked about in the previous episode. Shorter, more random games have, higher possibility to be decided by just one fluky kind of draw, which is probably what you need to win. So it can be helpful there. But I do want to stress that's pretty low percentage, pretty small difference. And actually, all of these are kind of small differences compared to you need to be getting cards that are advancing your game plan, kind of in any respect. These are going to be, strictly speaking, like if you have free gains and a watchtower in hand that you can immediately trash the card, fine. And there wasn't anything else you were doing with those gains, then fine. But usually you want to be either increasing your deck's capability to some extent and or scoring points to help position yourself for the end game. And lowering piles is not like the hugest concern you should have, except insofar as you need to make sure that it's not super easy for your opponent to win, and or of course if it's emptying all the piles to 0 and that gives you like a forced win, then yeah, great, obviously do that. So these are some general categories, and now I want to talk about kind of the problem that I see people doing a lot. They'll set up a pile out, they'll lower piles to try to set up a pile out. And this goes against what I've just said because, and when I say they're doing this in a situation where their deck is better and they're advantaged, and right, they should expect to win the game, and certainly, they have a better deck than their opponent, so the long game is good for them. But they'll set up a pile out because it wins faster. The problem is, just like we talked about in the first game, in the first one of these last few videos, losing slower isn't losing less, it's just losing slower. It's not losing less assuredly, it's just losing slower. Winning faster isn't winning more, it's just winning faster, and winning faster isn't winning more assuredly, it's just winning faster. Again, sometimes setting up a pile out, like you have it guaranteed on your next turn, and so then it's obviously totally fine. Your opponent can't do anything about it. Then, yeah, go ahead and set up that pile out for the next turn. But if it's not guaranteed, you really want to think about it. Right, if your deck is better than your opponent's, you shouldn't be lowering piles for the sake of lowering piles, generally. Again, unless you have some kind of pretty good guarantee that may not be in place later on. And the reason why this is bad is, depending on how far ahead you are, maybe lowering the pile. Well, the first reason why it's bad is you better make sure you calculate it right, because if you've missed something and they're able to pile out, then you've just like stumbled into a loss, right? Presumably you're not lowering piles to the extent where your opponent can just win the game on this turn if you're ahead like this. But sometimes you do that, and sometimes you've miscalculated. So that's bad. But I'm assuming you haven't miscalculated. And we'll talk about the calculation in the second half of the episode, where I talk about some specific pile out things to watch for. But in the first part here, I want to talk about, okay, so maybe you've miscalculated and they're able to do something that you didn't calculate and they just win immediately. But okay, let's assume you've calculated right and they can't win immediately. Well, now, first of all, the next thing that you have to worry about is, I say first of all a lot when I'm in the middle of a list, so, that's weird. But you need to worry about, my point is, you need to worry about, okay, are you really setting up a pile out that's favorable to you, or like, even if your opponent scores, you're still going to be able to pile out? Is that a thing? Or if they score, are you going to be able to score more and still pile out? Or are you going to be able to score enough and you can't pile out, but it's still advantageous to you? Or are you going to have to score and then suddenly the piles being lower isn't necessarily advantageous to you because you're in this scoring race and the piles being low doesn't really help? So that's something. When you're lowering piles, generally, if you're doing it for that reason, you want it to be able to prevent them from improving their deck safely. So either they have to take a big risk that you might pile out, or they can't improve their deck as much as they would like to. So which piles and what the alternatives to those piles are also important. So that's another thing. The other reason why it's bad, and this is the biggest thing, is in this situation where you're very far ahead and it's not like assured, is that I think the number of filler words that I'm saying here is just way too high and a lot of ums, but it's hard to podcast alone sometimes. Sue me. Don't actually sue me, because I haven't provided you anything, and there's no grounds for which you can sue me on. Like, constitutionally, you have a mandate to be able to sue for something that costs $20 or more, but I haven't deprived you of $20 worth of value. For one thing, the podcast is free. For another thing, no one's forcing you to listen to it. For another thing, I'm way off topic now. So let's go back and talk about why in these situations setting these pileouts up is bad. So the biggest reason why this is bad is just, you're ahead by some amount and it's a deck quality lead, and let's say you're up by a solid but not huge margin. Setting up the pile out makes it more likely that just like I have a single dud, and now because I've lowered the piles, my single dud, my opponent can have 2 turns that they can beat me. They can do that quote unquote risky line we talked about in the safe plays episode, and if you have a dud, then they can win, right? So you're setting yourself up to be able to lose when you dud. So that's not something you want to do. Or maybe you're ahead by more. You're setting yourself up to lose on 2 consecutive duds, which is less likely but still possible. Or maybe you're ahead by more. You're setting yourself up to lose on 3 consecutive duds. And at this point, you're thinking, wonder, how can someone have 3 consecutive duds? But man, sometimes there's decks where, or woman, or girl, or boy, or non-binary representation word that you want to. I'm not trying to offend anyone when I say man. Okay, that's my point here. So I apologize if saying man is offensive to you. That wasn't my intention. The point is, It can happen sometimes, person. Um, it can happen sometimes, particularly. I mean, it depends on what kind of deck you're in, but let's say you're drawing a lot with stables. You draw a hand of 5 stables, and now you have multiple duds in a row. Um, let's say you're drawing with some kind of village and smithy variant. You draw all your villages together or all of your smithies together, and now you're dudding not just once but multiple turns in a row. So, like, this stuff is not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed all the time at all. Now, sometimes it is guaranteed, because, like, I have 10 tokens on my Sinister plot, so I can draw 10 cards, and then there is no 15 card hand that I can draw that can't do it, whatever. I'm not talking about the cases where it's strictly guaranteed. Where it's strictly guaranteed, it's a forced win. You can win however you want. Go ahead and do it. But what I'm talking about is if it lets you have like N duds, then and lose because of that, then why did you risk that? If you're so much ahead, you should be able to even play around, how do I lose this game? And lowering piles is usually falls into ways that you can lose the game, even though it also usually falls into ways that you can win the game faster. Now, having said that, I do this sometimes in some of the cases where I'm like massively, massively ahead. I will lower piles to set up the pile out because, I mean, usually I have a pretty big points lead on top of my big deck lead. The reason I'll do it is because just like I want the game to be over with, and there's some life equity to having shorter games. So I'm not trying to criticize that. I'm saying, in terms of strictly speaking, trying to maximize your win percentage, setting up the pileouts where your deck is like a lot better than your opponent's is not often or usually the thing to do. Before I move on to the second half where I talk about specific things to watch out for with pileouts, I do want to mention, as I have been in these few episodes, why I think this happens somewhat. The first reason is actually just what I said, which is people want the game to be over with faster, and so they'll play to end it faster. That's not really a strategic reason, but I think it's a practical reason, which is perfectly valid and can come up. But you will lose some percentage of win chances, and depending on like how far you're ahead and how far your points you're up and how far your deck is better, it might actually be that you're losing kind of significant percentages, or if you're just like massively ahead, maybe it's 1/100% or something, in which case it probably doesn't really matter what you do that much. But yeah, anyway, so the speed thing is one thing, but the other thing is there's this thought that like the shorter the game is, the less likely it is that my opponent can come back because there's less time for some, I don't know, whatever to happen. Right, in chess, mate in 3 is generally considered to be more favorable than, mate in 12. And okay, in mate in 12 it's forced, but like there's more time for you to make a mistake. Or if you're playing a game like Magic, right, killing your opponent faster can be more advantageous than killing them slower because it gives them fewer turns to draw some haymaker to bust out of it. And that kind of concept can also come up in Dominion, but in a lot of cases it doesn't. In a lot of cases it's just your deck is better, and so you want the game to go longer, which is what I'm railing against here, is lowering piles in that situation. But there are some situations where emptying it faster reduces your risk, even if you are very far ahead, because it reduces the chance that your opponent, instead of you having the fluke draw in a dud, maybe your opponent has the fluke draw where everything just lines up super well. So like if they have 2 King's Courts and 3 Bridges in their deck and like 25 bad cards, then ending the game faster might be advantageous to you because it gives them less time to connect KC Bridge Bridge or something, right? So it's not always bad in these cases, but yeah, most of the time the game is not really like that, and lowering piles for you gives them some opportunities, even in that Casey Bridge scenario, to where maybe they can pile out with some kind of a weaker hand, where they have Casey Bridge a couple of times or something. So you really have to weigh whether your opponent having some fluky great turn is a bigger risk than you dudding. And in the big majority of cases that I find, you dudding is the bigger risk, but yeah, it is something you need to weigh either way. And that's weigh two ways. Weigh, W-E-I-G-H, either weigh, W-A-Y, two ways, W-A-Y-S. Did I say W-E-Y? Anyway, let's move on to some specific things to look for in pileouts. So, to some respect, you know, it's very broad and I can't cover everything. These are just some things that I think are kind of easy to overlook um, with specific piles or specific things that are around. So curse is a pile that can run and people don't think about it. Um, Obviously, the most likely way is that it runs just from cursing attacks. And you need to think about cursing attacks even when it's not totally empty, because the cursing attack effectively represents an extra gain, which gets the pile out closer. Um, you're not really gaining it, your opponent is, but it still lowers the pile, right? So that's one way, and that's the kind of boring, obvious way. Cursed gold, again, it's an extra gain of a curse, and that can be pile control sometimes. And I've had people miss that against me, and I think I may have missed it against opponents. The thing about curse pileouts, obviously the big thing is that it's negative 10 points, and you need to be up by a lot of points to be able to take on 10 points and still empty the pile. Negative 10 points, that is. So that's something else to watch out for, is that, okay, yeah, they can empty it maybe, but won't that point thing be really bad for them? And it takes a ton of buys, right? That's like 10 extra buys. But if buys are super plentiful and money maybe not, then curse a pile out may be something to watch for. The other things are goons. Goons, if you have a few goons in play, it's suddenly not necessarily negative points, and goons give you extra buys anyway. So, look for it a little bit more than normal with goons. Look for it also a little bit more than normal similarly, but to a slightly lesser extent with triumph, because you're scoring the point back from triumph, and if you have multiple triumphs, you're scoring more points back. So triumph can be a way there. Swamp Hag is a cursing attack, but it's a little bit different than the others. Playing Swamp Hags or playing enough Swamp Hags sometimes lets your opponent pile out on curses by just buying whatever normal cards. So usually that's going to be bad for them, but sometimes they can use it to their advantage, so be aware of that. Yeah, be aware of it. Watchtower lets you empty curses without the negative points, because you can, trash them immediately. And embargo, you can embargo something else you're buying, or you can embargo the curses, and that cuts in half the number of buys you need. If you multiply embargo something, then it reduces it even more. So embargo is a way to set up some curse pileouts, and it's one of my favorite things to do, even if it isn't, strictly speaking, necessary super often. Move to another pile, which is estate. Again, there's some things that just make you want to have estates more. So like inheritance or shepherd or something are going to make the estates more valuable to have in your deck. So they're probably going to run, but it's probably not really going to be a pile out that's happening from them. So just, bear in mind, yes, they will probably run because of these, but whatever. Similar to curse, having a bunch of extra buys is a big deal. That can happen from wharves. Unlike with curse, you need to have money. So a little bit of cost reduction, maybe from bridge trolls, comes up with this, or canal makes it easier to do with just a lot of buys and not a ton of money. But watch out for things that give you lots of extra buys and will probably help you make money, like Grand Market, Wharf, City. Those are things that help the estates pile out. And the important thing about the estates pile out is it does score a little bit of points for you in the process. So, like, just taking one quote-unquote safety province isn't enough if your opponent can get 8 estates as their third pile, because 8 estates outscores one province. So it is really something to be aware of in that sense. Other things that can help estates pile out: Baron. Baron can be, just money and buys for like normal, and that can normally be a pile out thing. But if gains are your pinch point and not money so much, then you can Baron to gain an estate, You don't have to discard an estate, even if you can. You can do it to gain an estate, which also gives you an extra buy, so it effectively can get you 2 extra gains for estates, so watch out for that. And then Wild Hunt, like, you can just say, okay, I've drawn enough, and now I'm going to Wild Hunt to gain estates 3 times as part of a pile out. So it's a gaining card exactly for estates. And then Triumph, again, this is more like Inheritance and Shepherd probably, as it's just like a thing where you want estates, although it's specifically because it's scoring a lot of points. But yeah, estates are going to pile out for Triumph pretty frequently. Just watch out for that. Let's move on. Messenger, yeah, Messenger's just an extra gain. Sometimes when you're calculating, you need to keep in mind that if they buy a Messenger first, you can give both people a thing, and that can effectively be an extra gain. Or if it's the Messenger pile, it's like a couple extra gains. Messenger pile isn't often the thing that's running, but sometimes it is. So yeah, just be aware that Messenger is an extra gain, can be an extra gain. Yeah, be aware of that. Stonemason. Stonemason is such a pile out card because not only is there the overpay with cost reduction especially, but even without, which gains, like 3 cards out of the supply for a single buy, which is huge. Also, the on-play effect gets 2 more cards out of the supply out of a single play, which can be huge. And if you can do gain and play stuff, yeah, piles run a lot with Stonemason. So be very aware of that. Let's move on to Villa. Villa pile can run out pretty easily because it's a favorable thing to get in a lot of cases, so people are going to start on it. But the other big thing is it doesn't cost you a buy to buy a Villa because you get it back when you gain the Villa and then play it. So it more or less effectively doesn't cost a buy usually. Again, there's some edge cases where sometimes it gives you an extra buy because you gained it instead of bought it, and it gains to hand, so you don't have to draw it. Sometimes it does cost you a buy somehow because you can't play it for whatever reason. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to play it, but whatever. And then they're a little bit cheaper than they look when you can play them because they make money. So they effectively cost 3, except the last one. If the last one is the last thing you're buying, it still costs 4. I saw somebody mess that up the other day and end up 1 money short of being able to pile out, and then a few turns later they ended up losing because of that. So yeah, miscalculations happen. Let's move to Ironworks. If you have enough distinct sources of draw for Ironworks, you can Ironworks and Ironworks play your draw card, Ironworks and Ironworks play a draw card, Ironworks and Ironworks play a draw card. I say distinct sources of draw. They usually will need to be like cantrips, non-terminal, or you're going to run out of terminal space, not from the Ironworks, but from the other stuff. But sometimes, let's say you have a few of them, you can go like, and you have a bunch of extra actions set up, you can go like Ironworks for an Ironworks 3 times, and then play a Smithy, and then Ironworks for an Ironworks 3 times, and then play a Smithy. Or if you have like infinite actions because you've got Champion in play, you can Ironworks for an Ironworks, Ironworks for an Ironworks, Ironworks for a Smithy, play a Smithy, Ironworks for an Ironworks, Ironworks for an Ironworks, play a Smithy, Ironworks for an Ironworks, Ironworks for an Ironworks, blah, blah, blah. And empty piles that way. It's not super common, but it's something you need to watch out for, that it's like gain and play and gain and play and gain and play. And you can do this with other kind of workshop variants that can gain themselves as well, but it's harder because they tend to be terminal in a lot of cases. And then some workshop variants don't gain themselves, like University can't gain itself, Artisan and Alter usually can't gain themselves, so watch out for that. Rats can autopile. So if you have a couple of rats in play, or a couple of rats in hand, and you've drawn through enough of your deck, then you can play a rats, gain a rats, it goes to your discard pile. You play another rats to draw the rats you just gained, and you gain another rats, and then you can just loop playing rats until they're all gone. In order to do this, you're going to trash many more cards in your hand that can't be rats, possibly very often all the other cards in your hand that aren't rats. So you need to either have some kind of, well, A, you need to be able to pile out just doing that, and not much else. So maybe you have money and buys to pile out otherwise that you've already have in play basically, so that after you shred your hand, it doesn't shred your ability to buy the other stuff you need to buy. You also need to be able to have a points lead after you've shredded the rest of your hand. So like if you've got provinces in hand and you don't have enough other stuff to trash, then you're going to lose all of them, and then maybe you don't have the lead when they pile. So yeah, be careful about that, but do watch out for it because it can happen sometimes to where you gain a couple rats and then you're off to the races and you pile out, and it doesn't look like the piles were low, but it only takes a couple rats and it's gone. Magpies have probably piled already by the time you're thinking about this, but they can also auto pile. If you get the right setup, you can magpie, which reveals a magpie. You need like 2 magpies in your discard and then a magpie in hand. Magpie reveals a magpie, gains a magpie, play a magpie, draw a magpie, reveal a magpie, gain a magpie, over and over, and those can auto pile. Like, that's very rare for it to come up, but it can come up. It's rare for it to come up, I should say, as a thing that ends the game, because usually the magpie is empty early. But yeah, anyway. Death Cart makes ruins pile quicker, so 5 gains of Death Cart is 10 gains of ruins, and that can make that pile. So where it doesn't look like they have enough gains, Death Cart might mean they have enough gains. Having said that, ruins themselves, similar to curses, what we talked about above, if you just have a ton of buys, it doesn't have the negative points problem. So ruins as a thing with just like where buys are really cheap, ruins can run also. Let's talk about ball next. Ball is gain multiplication. So sometimes it's extra money because it gains like multiple 4 costs or 3 costs, so it makes you a little bit of money in for your pile out as well. But sometimes it's strictly just, you have a limited number of buys. You have 4 buys. You can ball for estates. You have a ton of money. You can ball for estates 4 times, and that empties the estate pile. It costs you more money, but it gives you the extra gains you need sometimes. So watch out for ball when you're trying to count gains that are available. Yep. Experiments evaporate pretty fast. Again, there's only 10 of them, but it only takes 5 gains to gain the pile out. And yeah, you just have to be a little bit wary because they're tricky, because they return themselves as a supply also. So if you have to play experiments to get to the things that let you gain experiments, then you need to be able to gain more of them. So just be careful around them because they can pile out, but yeah. Talisman. Talisman, kind of obvious. Just halves the number of buys you need for cheap stuff. What are you going to say? Sometimes there's gain in play where you gain a talisman and that halves the buys. Ambassador. So one of the obnoxious things about Ambassador is that it's so good early on, but it's actually still good late. I mean, you're continuing to send a little bit of junk back and forth, but also it's a tool for pileouts, right? You reveal and return 0 of a thing, and you have 2 ambassadors from the early game anyway, and that's 2 extra gains for pile control. You usually don't want to do that till like right at the very end because you don't have good things in your deck that you're sending to them. So just like be careful, but be aware of it. It happens with provinces a good amount, but it also can happen with whatever other like component pile, and it's just extra gains to be able to dance around in the ending. So watch out for ambassadors. Lurker, again, it's not the main point of Lurker, but it can be very useful at the end. You've got 4 lurkers because you're gaining 2 things a turn with them. Your opponent also has 4 lurkers because they were gaining 2 things a turn with them. And at some point, you need to be aware that you don't have to gain things. You could just trash 4 things, and that's, boom, a lot closer to a pile out. So watch out for that with Lurker. Border Village is going to run out usually, or pretty often anyway, but it may take some time, so it may be involved in a pile out. This one's pretty obvious, but basically just like you buy a Border Village or you gain a Border Village, and that's 2 gains because it's also going to gain a cheaper thing. So, there's 2 piles at 2, and your opponent only has 2 buys because the only plus buy in the game is Pouch. Well, they can Border Village into the other thing twice, and that's a pile out for them. So watch out for that. And then the last thing I want to talk about is one that I just had very recently in a game, which is Banquet. Banquet doesn't help you get extra gains at all unless copper is one of the piles. So shout out to the edge case of copper being one of the piles. But yeah, Banquet is. I guess it could go into a whole lot of things for copper being a pile, but I'm not going to. I'm not. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. But Banquet, what it does is it makes the pile out cheaper. So if there's things that cost 4 or especially 5 that you need to pile out, and your opponent, you normally wouldn't have the money for it, and normally you wouldn't want to necessarily Banquet for them a lot because just like adding so many coppers to your deck is not worth it, maybe, or not worth it usually. But in a pile out scenario, yeah, it doesn't matter. You're not going to carry the coppers around at the end of the game. So, or later on because the game is ending. So in a pile out scenario, Banquet just makes all the pile outs that don't involve victory cards cheaper. Not all of them, but the 4 and 5 cost ones. So yeah, this is just a beginning in talking about things to watch out for with pile outs. But hopefully between the first half, in terms of being wary of setting up pile outs for pile outs' sake, particularly when you have a deck control / long game advantage, and the second half on various things that you want to watch out for with pile outs. Hopefully you've been able to learn something. Maybe this is all boring to you because some of the stuff's kind of obvious, but I don't know. You can leave comments on other things to watch out for with pile outs. Like I say, this is certainly not a comprehensive list of things, so if you want to help other listeners out, maybe you'll get, if you have a really good one, you can get it mentioned on a later episode. Yeah. Anyway, as always, of course, any comments or questions you have, please feel free to leave a comment on this web zone. Again, we're not going to send you a pizza roll, but you can, go microwave one yourself. And this has been Wandering Winter, signing off.